The sting of my mother's hand across my face still burned as I stood frozen in the marble foyer of the Grandview Country Club, surrounded by 200 guests who had fallen into shocked silence. The emerald gown I wore, custom Valentino, though she didn't know that, suddenly felt like a costume, and for one disorienting moment, I was 12 years old again, being reprimanded for speaking too loudly at dinner. Except this time, my head of security, a former Royal Protection officer named James Whitmore, had stepped between us with a calm authority that made my mother's face drain of all color, and I realized that the carefully constructed fiction of my life was about to shatter in front of everyone who mattered to her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Just 6 hours earlier, she had called me an embarrassment to the family name when I had refused to cancel my little charity project to attend her fundraising gala. "You're throwing away your life on these people, Natasha," she'd said, her voice sharp with that particular disappointment I'd learned to expect. "Playing social worker when you should be focusing on finding a suitable match. The Ashford name deserves better than this." The Ashford name. Always the Ashford name, as though our family's legacy of old money and older prejudices was more important than actual human dignity. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my little charity project had just been awarded the International Humanitarian Innovation Prize, complete with a $15 million grant and a private meeting scheduled with the United Nations Secretary General next month. What she didn't know was that the nonprofit organization I'd built from nothing over the past 4 years, Safe Harbor Initiative, now operated in 23 countries providing emergency housing and legal protection for displaced families. What she didn't know was that the bodyguard she'd dismissed as unnecessary dramatics when she'd spotted him at the gala entrance was actually assigned to me by the UK Foreign Office after credible threats from human trafficking networks whose operations we'd helped dismantle. And what she definitely didn't know was that everyone in this room, her carefully curated guest list of society's elite, was about to find out. The slap had come 30 seconds ago, maybe less, though time seemed to have stretched into something elastic and strange. I'd arrived at the gala despite her demands that I skip it, unable to completely abandon the daughter's role she'd spent 28 years molding me into. I'd walked in quietly, hoping to avoid confrontation, to perhaps stay for an hour and leave before my absence became an insult she could weaponize later. But she'd spotted me immediately, intercepted me before I'd made it past the entrance, and hissed those words that had become her refrain. "You're embarrassing this family with your little projects. When will you grow up and take responsibility for who you are?" Something in me had finally broken. Maybe it was exhaustion. I just returned from 3 weeks in Jordan, helping establish our newest shelter facility. Maybe it was the weight of maintaining two completely separate identities, the disappointing daughter who couldn't live up to the Ashford legacy and the executive director of an award-winning humanitarian organization. Maybe it was simply that I'd reached the limit of how many times I could hear my life's work reduced to a hobby, a phase, an embarrassment. "I am taking responsibility," I'd said, my voice quiet but steady. "More than you know." That's when she'd hit me. Not a dramatic movie slap, but a sharp, stinging crack across my cheek that sent my head sideways and brought instant tears to my eyes, not from pain, but from the sudden, crushing weight of 28 years of never being enough. The conversations around us had stopped mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. The string quartet in the corner played on for 3 more notes before the cellist noticed the silence and dragged her bow to a discordant halt. And then James had moved. Not rushed, not aggressive, but with the fluid precision of someone trained to assess and neutralize threats. He'd positioned himself between us, his 6'3" frame suddenly seeming much larger in his immaculate dark suit, and his hand raised in a gesture that was somehow both deferential and absolutely unyielding. "Sir," he'd said to my mother, his accent crisp British formality. "I'm going to need you to step back, please." My mother had stared at him as though he had materialized out of thin air. "Excuse me, who do you think you—" "James Whitmore, Royal Protection Command, on assignment with the Foreign Office. I'm Director Ashford's head of security, and I cannot allow any further physical contact." Director Ashford. The title hung in the air between us like a detonation waiting to explode. My mother's face had gone from flushed anger to pale confusion in the span of a single breath. "Director, security. What do you—" And she darted her eyes between James and me, and I watched the calculations happening behind her expression, the desperate attempt to reconcile what she was hearing with the narrative she'd constructed about my life. Around us, phones were emerging from purses and pockets. The society crowd, sensing drama more significant than the usual gossip, had begun recording, and, standing near the bar, I recognized two faces that made my stomach clench. Diane Thornbury from the Chronicle's Society pages, and worse, Richard Hammond from the International News Network, who'd been covering humanitarian work in the Middle East and had apparently been invited to this fundraiser for reasons I was about to understand all too well. This was the moment. The collision of my two worlds that I'd managed to keep separate for 4 years through careful compartmentalization and strategic omission. The moment when my mother would have to confront not just what I'd been doing, but who I'd become while she'd been dismissing me as a disappointment. James remained positioned between us, his stance protective, but his expression neutral, waiting for my signal on how to proceed. Behind him, my mother looked smaller somehow, her carefully composed society mask cracking at the edges as the implications of what she'd just heard began to penetrate. "Natasha," she said slowly, and for the first time in memory, I heard uncertainty in her voice. "What is he talking about?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I took a breath, tasted blood from where my lip had caught against my tooth, and realized that there was no going back from this moment. The truth was about to come out, and with it, every assumption my mother had made about my life, my worth, and my purpose was about to be systematically dismantled. The question was whether our relationship could survive what came next. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood in that gilded country club foyer, my cheeks still burning from my mother's hand, that this building represented everything she valued and everything I'd learned to question. The Grandview Country Club, with its old-world architecture and older money membership, had been the backdrop of my childhood, a stage where appearances mattered more than authenticity, where the right last name opened doors that talent and character never could. My mother, Claudia Ashford, had built her identity around places like this. She'd been president of the club's Ladies' Auxiliary for 12 years, chaired countless fundraisers, and cultivated relationships with the kind of precision other people reserved for growing orchids. The Ashford name, already prestigious from my late father's banking empire, had become synonymous under her careful stewardship with a particular brand of Philadelphia society, traditional, exclusive, and utterly convinced of its own superiority. I had been raised to be her masterpiece, the finest private schools, Thornfield Academy, then Radcliffe College, cotillion at 15, my debut at the Belmont Ball at 18, every step carefully choreographed to position me for what she considered life's ultimate achievement, a strategic marriage to someone from an equally prominent family, followed by a life of charitable committee work and social prominence. The turning point had come during my junior year at Radcliffe, when I'd volunteered with a student group providing legal aid to asylum seekers in Boston. I'd met a woman named Amara, a former teacher from Syria who'd fled with her 3 children after her husband was killed. She'd been living in a shelter, navigating an impossibly complex immigration system while trying to keep her family together and her children in school. I'd helped her fill out paperwork, nothing more. But watching her cry with relief when we'd secured temporary protected status, seeing her youngest daughter smile for the first time in our meetings, something had cracked open inside me. For the first time, I understood that my privilege wasn't just something to be maintained and displayed. It could be deployed. It could matter. My mother had been less impressed when I'd mentioned it over Thanksgiving break. "That's lovely, dear. Volunteering is important for your resume, but do be careful not to get too attached to these projects. You have your own future to consider." These projects, the phrase would become her favorite dismissal over the years that followed. After graduation, the expectations intensified. There were introductions to eligible sons of her friends, young men with trust funds and law degrees, whose conversation rarely extended beyond market performance and vacation properties. There were pointed comments about my extended gap year when I'd taken a position at a nonprofit, instead of pursuing graduate school or a position at one of the banks, where the Ashford name still carried weight. "When are you going to do something serious with your life, Natasha?" she'd asked over lunch at her club 18 months after graduation. "This refugee work is admirable, I suppose, but it's not a career. It's not building anything. You're 24 years old. It's time to think about your future." What she didn't know, what I'd deliberately kept from her, was that I'd already begun building Safe Harbor Initiative. Using a modest inheritance from my paternal grandmother, the one member of our family who'd always encouraged my impractical idealism, I'd quietly incorporated the organization, recruited a small team of lawyers and social workers, and begun developing a model that integrated emergency housing with legal advocacy and community support. The secrecy wasn't strategic initially. I simply hadn't mentioned it, knowing any discussion would result in her usual dismissal. But as Safe Harbor grew, as we opened our second facility and then our third, as media attention began to find us, the secrecy became more deliberate. I maintained 2 separate lives with the kind of precision that would have impressed her if she'd known about it. To my mother and her social circle, I was Natasha Ashford, the disappointing daughter who'd never quite lived up to her potential. Still unmarried at 28, still playing at charity work instead of settling down, still an embarrassment to the family name. To everyone else, to the international humanitarian community, to the families we served, to the governments and NGOs we partnered with, I was Director Ashford, founder and executive director of Safe Harbor Initiative, a rising voice in refugee advocacy whose innovative integration model had been featured in Foreign Policy magazine and The Guardian. The cognitive dissonance was sometimes absurd. 3 months ago, I'd given a keynote address at the International Humanitarian Summit in Geneva, speaking to an audience of 800 aid workers, diplomats, and policymakers. 2 days later, I'd sat through dinner at my mother's house while she explained to her bridge club friends that I was still figuring things out and working with some immigration group in the city. When I'd tried, once, to correct the characterization, "It's actually an international organization now, Mother. We operate in 23 countries." She'd patted my hand and changed the subject to ask if I'd met the new associate at Hammond and Price, her lawyer's firm, who came from an excellent family. The pattern had been consistent for 4 years. Every milestone was diminished. When Safe Harbor won the Rockwell Foundation's Social Innovation Award and a $3 million grant, she'd ask if that was One of those participation trophy things everyone gets nowadays. When we'd opened facilities in Jordan and Greece, she'd expressed concern about my excessive travel interfering with my social obligations. When the death threats started, an inevitable consequence of disrupting human trafficking networks, and the Foreign Office assigned James as my security detail, she'd called it melodramatic and suggested I was making myself important. The threats weren't melodramatic. They were specific, credible, and had required James and his team to conduct security assessments of everywhere I lived and worked. James himself was former Royal Protection Command, the unit that guards the British royal family, recruited specifically because of his experience protecting high-value targets in hostile environments. My mother had met him exactly once before tonight, 3 weeks ago when I'd stopped by her house to drop off documents she'd needed. She'd opened the door to find James standing behind me, professional and alert, and her expression had shifted through confusion to amusement. "Natasha, darling, what is this?" "This is James. He's my security detail." She'd actually laughed. "Security detail? For what? Are you pretending to be important now?" This is exactly the kind of theatrical nonsense I'm talking about. You're not a diplomat or a celebrity. You're a girl who volunteers with immigrants. This is absurd. James, to his credit, had remained perfectly neutral, though I'd caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was filing away this interaction for later discussion. I hadn't argued with her. What would have been the point? She'd already decided what my life was, what my work meant, what I was worth. Evidence to the contrary only made her dig deeper into her certainty. The final straw, the one that had led to tonight's confrontation, had come 6 hours ago when she'd called demanding I cancel my trip to the safe harbor facility in Athens to attend tonight's gala. "Your little charity project can wait one day, Natasha. This fundraiser is important for the family's reputation. The Westbrook Foundation Board will be here, and the Carringtons, and half the city's major donors. Your absence would be noted and remarked upon." "Mother, I can't just cancel. There are 40 families relying on—" "There you go again, making excuses. Do you know how embarrassing it is when people ask about you and I have to explain that you're off doing volunteer work instead of attending family obligations? When will you grow up and take this family seriously?" I'd made it to the airport before turning around. Not because she was right, but because I was tired. Tired of the constant daddle, tired of defending myself, tired of maintaining these parallel lives that seemed increasingly unsustainable. So I'd come to the gala. I'd put on the designer dress I'd worn to the UN reception last month, not that she'd recognized it. I'd brought James, because security protocols didn't disappear just because my mother found them inconvenient. And I'd walked into her carefully curated world one more time, hoping to avoid confrontation. Instead, I'd gotten a slap in the face and a moment of truth I hadn't planned for, but perhaps should have seen coming. The collision of these two worlds, the one in which I was a disappointment and the one in which I was a director, had become inevitable. Standing here now with James positioned protectively between me and my mother, with 200 witnesses recording on their phones, I realized that the compartmentalization I'd maintained for 4 years had just catastrophically failed. And there was no going back. The origins of Safe Harbor Initiative traced back to a moment that had nothing to do with grand ambitions or careful planning, just a single encounter that refused to let me go. It was October of my senior year at Radcliffe, and I'd been dragged to a legal aid clinic orientation by my roommate, Priya, who'd signed us both up without asking. I'd gone reluctantly, viewing it as an obligation to fulfill before midterms consumed my attention. The clinic occupied a cramped office in a converted brownstone in Dorchester, staffed by exhausted law students and overworked social workers trying to help people navigate immigration proceedings with impossibly limited resources. The waiting room was packed. Families with children, elderly couples,
young men with haunted eyes, all holding folders stuffed with documents, all wearing the same expression of desperate hope, barely containing deeper fear.
I'd been assigned to assist with intake forms, basic administrative work that required no legal expertise. That's when I met Amara Hassan, 34 years old, former English teacher from Aleppo, widow, mother of 3. She'd arrived at the clinic with a garbage bag containing every document related to her asylum case: court notices, medical records, her children's school papers, her husband's death certificate, all mixed together because she had nowhere else to keep them safe. "I don't want to lose anything," she'd explained in careful English, her hands shaking as she tried to organize the papers on the intake desk. "If I lose the papers, they send us back. If they send us back, my children—" She'd stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. I'd spent 3 hours helping her sort documents, create copies, establish a filing system. Simple organizational work, nothing heroic, but as we worked, she'd told me her story in fragments. The bombing of her school, her husband's death, the 2-year journey through Turkey and then across the Atlantic, the shelter where they'd lived for 8 months, her teenage son sleeping on a cot in a room with 6 other families, her daughters sharing a single bed, all of them existing in suspended animation while their asylum case crawled through the system. "The hardest part isn't the waiting," she'd said quietly, filing her husband's death certificate into the folder we'd created. "It's that every system assumes you're lying. Every official treats you like you're trying to cheat, trying to take something you don't deserve. You lose your home, your family, everything you built, and then you lose your dignity too, piece by piece, because you need help, and help only comes with suspicion." That observation had lodged in my chest like a splinter. The recognition that the systems designed to help refugees were structured around distrust, that accessing assistance required surrendering dignity in exchange for scrutiny, that the trauma of displacement was compounded by the dehumanization of seeking refuge. 6 weeks later, Amara's asylum petition had been approved. I'd been there when she received the notice, watched her collapse into tears of relief, heard her call her children on a borrowed phone to tell them they were safe. And I'd felt something shift fundamentally in how I understood my own privilege and its potential application. The inheritance from my grandmother had come at precisely the right moment, or perhaps I'd finally recognized it as the right moment. Evelyn Ashford, my father's mother, had been the family iconoclast, the one who'd traveled extensively, supported unconventional causes, and maintained that privilege was a responsibility rather than an entitlement. She'd left me $800,000 when she died during my junior year, along with a letter that I'd carried in my wallet ever since. "Use this to matter, Natasha. Not to be comfortable, not to be safe, but to matter. The world has enough wealthy people who accomplish nothing except maintaining their wealth. Be different. Be difficult if necessary, but matter." I'd incorporated Safe Harbor Initiative 3 months after graduation, using $200,000 of the inheritance to lease a small building in South Philadelphia, hire 2 staff members, and establish our first integrated facility. The model was simple in concept, complex in execution. Provide immediate housing, legal advocacy, and community integration support simultaneously rather than forcing families to navigate separate, disconnected systems. Traditional approaches kept these services siloed. Families found housing through one organization, legal help through another, employment assistance through a third. They spent enormous energy coordinating between agencies, repeating their traumatic stories to multiple intake workers, trying to comply with conflicting requirements from different programs. The inefficiency was cruel, transforming already traumatized people into full-time navigators of bureaucratic systems. Safe Harbor integrated everything under one roof. When families arrived, they received immediate housing in our facility, not a shelter with cots and shared bathrooms, but actual apartments with private space, kitchens, dignity. Simultaneously, our legal team began asylum proceedings, while our community specialists connected them with employment, education, and healthcare resources. One intake, one case manager, one coordinated approach. The model worked better than I anticipated. Our first year, we served 18 families.
By year 2, we'd expanded to a second facility and served 43. The outcomes were dramatically better than traditional approaches. Higher rates of successful asylum petitions, faster integration into employment, better mental health indicators, children performing better in school. The success attracted attention from other organizations, foundation program officers, eventually journalists covering immigration issues. By year 3, we'd opened facilities in 3 cities and were fielding inquiries from international partners about replicating the model abroad. Throughout this growth, I'd maintained careful separation from my mother's world. I used my middle name. Natasha Ray Ashford became Natasha Ray in professional contexts. I avoided media interviews that might circulate in Philadelphia city circles. I kept my home address private, maintained separate social media accounts, essentially created a firewall between Director Ray of Safe Harbor Initiative and Natasha Ashford, disappointing daughter of Claudia Ashford. The compartmentalization required constant vigilance. When Safe Harbor opened our facility in Jordan, partnering with local NGOs to provide services near the Syrian border, I told my mother I was doing some consulting work overseas. When we'd been invited to present at the European Parliament on refugee integration policy, I'd said I was taking a vacation in Brussels. When the Rockwell Foundation granted us $3 million for expansion, I'd simply not mentioned it at all. The lies of omission piled up, creating an alternate reality where my life remained small, disappointing, stuck. And my mother had accepted this reality without question because it confirmed what she already believed, that I was wasting my potential, that my work was insignificant, that I needed to refocus on what really mattered.
The breaking point had been building for months before tonight. As Safe Harbor's profile increased, maintaining the separation became progressively more difficult. We'd been featured in a New York Times article on innovative refugee services. I'd been invited to speak at the Council on Foreign Relations. The Foreign Office security assessment, following specific threats from trafficking networks we'd disrupted in Greece, had resulted in James's assignment, impossible to hide or explain away. My mother had noticed the increased travel, the security presence, the evasive answers about my work. But rather than curiosity, these changes had triggered increased criticism. The more significant my actual life became, the more disappointed she grew in what she perceived as my continued directionlessness. "You're 28 years old, still playing at charity work," she'd said last month over lunch at the club. "When will you take yourself seriously? When will you build something real?" I'd almost told her then, almost laid out the entire truth, the organization, the funding, the international work, the actual impact we were creating. But looking at her across the table in her Chanel suit, surrounded by women who measured success in country club memberships and strategic marriages, I'd realized she might not be capable of understanding. Her framework for evaluating worth was so fundamentally different from mine that translation seemed impossible. So I'd said nothing, changed the subject, maintained the fiction for a few weeks longer, until tonight, when that fiction had died violently in front of 200 witnesses, killed by my mother's hand and resurrected by James's quiet intervention. The parallel realities I'd maintained for 4 years had collided, and there was no reconstructing the careful boundaries that had kept them separate. Standing in that country club foyer, like cheeks still burning, watching my mother's confusion deepen as she tried to reconcile Director Ashford with her disappointing daughter, I felt the weight of 4 years of compartmentalization finally lifting. The truth was about to emerge, comprehensive and undeniable, and whatever came next would have to be built on actual reality rather than convenient fictions. The silence in the country club foyer stretched impossibly long, though it probably lasted only seconds. 200 people held their collective breath, phones raised, capturing what would undoubtedly become the scandal of Philadelphia's social season. My mother stood frozen 3 feet away, separated from me by James's protective stance, her face cycling through emotions faster than I could catalog them: confusion, disbelief, anger, and something that might have been fear. "Director," she repeated, the word emerging strained and uncertain. "Natasha, what is this man talking about?" Before I could formulate a response, a voice cut through the tension from somewhere near the bar area. Mrs. Ashford, I believe I can clarify. Richard Hammond emerged from the crowd, his press credentials from the International News Network visible on his lanyard. I'd noticed him earlier, but hadn't understood his presence at what should have been a routine society fundraiser. Now, watching him approach with a journalist's predatory interest in a developing story, I felt my stomach drop. My mother turned toward him with visible relief, recognizing a familiar face in this suddenly incomprehensible situation. Richard Hammond had covered international humanitarian crises for 15 years. His reporting from conflict zones earned him 2 Peabody Awards. He'd also grown up in Philadelphia society, the son of Caroline and Thomas Hammond, members of my mother's social circle. "Richard, thank God," my mother said, her voice steadying slightly. "Can you please explain what's happening here? Why is my daughter's security person calling her director and claiming she needs protection?" Richard's expression carried something between professional interest and personal amusement as he glanced between my mother and me. "Mrs. Ashford, your daughter is Natasha Ray, correct? Director and founder of Safe Harbor Initiative." The use of my professional name, my middle name that I'd adopted to maintain separation, landed like a small explosion. My mother's eyes snapped to me with new intensity. "Ray, why is he calling you—" "I've been using my middle name professionally to keep work separate from this." I gestured vaguely at the opulent surroundings, the designer-clad guests, the world she'd built. Richard continued, apparently enjoying the revelation more than journalistic ethics should probably allow. Safe Harbor Initiative is one of the most innovative refugee service organizations operating internationally. They've revolutionized integration models, currently operate in 23 countries, and just last week were awarded the International Humanitarian Innovation Prize. The ceremony is scheduled for next month at the UN. Each fact landed like a separate blow. I watched my mother's face as she processed information that contradicted everything she believed she knew about my life. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again without producing sound. "That's impossible," she finally managed. "Natasha works with some small immigration group here in Philadelphia. She's been doing volunteer work, nothing serious, certainly nothing international." "With respect, Mrs. Ashford," James interjected, his British accent making the interruption somehow more polite, "Director Ashford has been running Safe Harbor's international operations for the past 4 years. The organization currently employs 217 staff members across 6 continents, maintains an annual operating budget of $42 million, and has successfully resettled over 3,000 families." The numbers, concrete, undeniable, documented, seemed to hit harder than abstract descriptions could. My mother actually swayed slightly, reaching out to steady herself against a marble column. "42 million?" she whispered. 3,000 families? That's impossible. She would have told me. She would have... Her eyes found mine, and for the first time I saw genuine confusion rather than dismissal. "Why wouldn't you tell me?"
The question hung between us, loaded with implications neither of us was prepared to fully address in this public setting. Around us, the crowd pressed closer, phones recording, conversations resuming in urgent whispers as people began searching online, confirming Richard's claims, discovering in real time that the woman they'd watched get slapped was not who anyone had thought. "Perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more private," James suggested quietly, his eyes scanning the crowd with professional assessment of the deteriorating security situation. But my mother wasn't ready to retreat. No, I want to understand this now. You've been lying to me for 4 years, pretending to be, what, unsuccessful, directionless, letting me think you were wasting your life when you were actually running some enormous organization? "I wasn't pretending," I said, finding my voice finally steady despite my racing heart. "I just stopped trying to convince you to see what you decided not to see." "What does that mean?" "It means every time I tried to share something real about my work, you dismissed it, reduced it, called it a hobby, a phase, an embarrassment. So eventually, I stopped sharing. I built Safe Harbor quietly, away from your judgment, in a space where my work could be valued for what it actually was."
My mother's face flushed, anger reasserting itself over confusion. So this is my fault? You lied to me for 4 years and somehow I'm the problem? I hit you, I said simply. 20 minutes ago, in front of 200 people, you slapped me across the face for embarrassing the family because I dared to suggest that my work you knew nothing about, might matter as much as this fundraiser. The reminder of the slap created visible ripples through the nearby crowd. Several people shifted uncomfortably. Diane Thornberry from the Chronicle was typing furiously on her phone, undoubtedly already drafting the story that would be online within the hour. My mother's hand rose unconsciously to her own face, perhaps mirroring the mark she'd left on mine. You were being disrespectful. You've been distant for months, canceling family obligations, disappearing on these trips without explanation. What was I supposed to think? You were supposed to ask, I said, and heard my voice crack slightly on the words. You were supposed to wonder where I was, what I was doing, why it mattered to me. You were supposed to be curious about your own daughter's life, instead of just disappointed that it didn't match your expectations. Richard Hammond, still standing nearby with his journalist's instinct for emotional climax, interjected again. Mrs. Ashford, your daughter was in Jordan 2 weeks ago negotiating with government officials to expand Safe Harbor's operations near the Syrian border. Last month, she testified before the European Parliament on refugee integration policy. 3 months ago, she was in Athens coordinating emergency response after a trafficking ring was dismantled, which, incidentally, is why she has Foreign Office security. He gestured to James. The threats against her are quite real. Each revelation seemed to physically impact my mother, as though the information had weight and mass. She looked at James with new eyes, finally understanding that his presence wasn't theatrical dramatics, but legitimate security necessity. Trafficking rings? Threats? Natasha, you could be... She stopped, unable to complete the thought. Why wouldn't you tell me you were in danger? Would you have believed me? I asked. Or would you have called it melodramatic, like you did the first time you met James? The accuracy of that prediction showed on her face. She had no defense because we both knew it was true. A new voice joined the conversation, female and sharp with authority. Perhaps everyone should step back and give them some space. A woman in her 60s pushed through the inner circle of onlookers, Patricia Westbrook, founder of the Westbrook Foundation, one of the evening's honored guests, and someone whose opinion carried weight in this crowd. She looked at my mother with an expression that mixed sympathy and reproach. Claudia, I think you and your daughter need to have a private conversation, and I think the rest of us need to respect that privacy. She turned to address the broader crowd, her tone brooking no argument. This is a family matter. Put away your phones, give them space. Now. The crowd began to reluctantly disperse, though I could see phones still recording from further away, hear the urgent whispers as people retreated to process what they had witnessed. The gala was effectively over, the careful social choreography shattered by violence and revelation. Patricia turned back to my mother, her voice softer but still firm. For what it's worth, Claudia, I've known about Natasha's work for 2 years. The Westbrook Foundation has been one of Safe Harbor's major funders. Your daughter is brilliant, accomplished, and making a genuine difference in the world. You should be immensely proud. She paused, though you might also consider apologizing for hitting her in public. With that, Patricia walked away, leaving us in a slightly less crowded but still very public space, surrounded by the wreckage of assumptions and the beginning of something neither of us knew how to navigate. My mother looked at me as though seeing a stranger. You took money from the Westbrook Foundation? Patricia knew about this before I did? 40 other foundations, too, I said tiredly. The Rockwell Foundation, the MacArthur Fellowship, the Open Society Institute. Safe Harbor has been funded by major philanthropic organizations for 3 years. It's not a secret, Mother. It's just not something you ever looked for.
She sank onto one of the lobby benches, her perfect posture finally collapsing. I don't understand any of this. How did I not know? How did everyone else know and I didn't? I sat down beside her, maintaining a careful distance. Because you decided who I was 4 years ago and never updated that assessment, despite mounting evidence that you were wrong. And because I let you believe it rather than fighting constantly to be seen. We sat in silence, the string quartet having resumed playing at some point, their music a surreal soundtrack to the dissolution of our relationship's foundational assumptions. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice small in a way I'd never heard. What happens now? I looked at James, still standing at a respectful distance, but clearly alert. I looked at Richard Hammond, retreating to the bar, but obviously still observing. I looked at the remaining guests, pretending to circulate, but watching us with barely concealed fascination. Now, I said quietly, we figure out if there's any version of our relationship that can exist based on who I actually am, rather than who you wanted me to be. James suggested we move to one of the private meeting rooms the club maintained for board sessions and confidential discussions. My mother agreed with uncharacteristic docility, still visibly shaken as we walked through corridors I'd known since childhood. The familiar surroundings, oil paintings of past club presidents, Persian rugs worn smooth by generations of expensive shoes, felt surreal given the circumstances. The room James selected was small but elegant, with a mahogany conference table and leather chairs that probably cost more than most families' monthly rent. He positioned himself by the door, present but allowing us privacy, his professional discretion apparent in how he made himself nearly invisible while remaining instantly available. My mother sat heavily in one of the chairs, her designer clutch placed carefully on the table as though maintaining that one small gesture of control might steady everything else that had become untethered. I remained standing, not out of aggression, but because sitting felt like pretending this was a normal conversation rather than the fundamental reckoning it actually was. I need you to tell me everything, she said finally, her voice stripped of its usual commanding tone. From the beginning. Not the version you think I want to hear. The truth. It was perhaps the first genuinely open question she had asked about my life in 4 years. I pulled out my phone, opening the Safe Harbor Initiative website, and slid it across the table to her. This is what I've built, I said simply. She picked up the phone with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the homepage. I watched her face as she absorbed the professional design, the testimonials from families we'd served, the interactive map showing our facility locations across 6 continents. She clicked through to the About page, and I saw the exact moment she found my photo and biography. Natasha Ray, founder and executive director, she read aloud. Her finger hovered over my professional headshot, me in a blazer, standing in front of our Athens facility, looking confident and purposeful in a way she'd probably never seen me. Bachelor's degree in social policy from Radcliffe College, master's degree in international relations from Johns Hopkins. She looked up sharply. Johns Hopkins? You told me you weren't pursuing graduate school. I did it online while running Safe Harbor's first facility. 2 years of night classes and weekend intensives. I graduated 18 months ago. She set the phone down as though it had burned her. You earned a master's degree and didn't mention it? You'd made it clear that my work wasn't worth discussing. Adding academic credentials to something you'd already dismissed as a hobby seemed pointless. My mother flinched at that assessment, but didn't argue. She picked up the phone again, continuing to scroll. I watched her discover our annual reports, our impact metrics, our partnership agreements with the UN Refugee Agency and various international NGOs. Each discovery seemed to deepen her disorientation as though the phone was showing her an alternate dimension, rather than simply information that had been publicly available all along. The Rockwell Foundation grant, she said, reading from our funding page. $3 million. That's not a small community donation, Natasha. That's serious institutional funding. We've received $47 million in foundation grants over 4 years, plus government contracts, individual donations, and partnership funding. The finances are audited annually by an independent firm. Everything is documented, legitimate, transparent. She set the phone down again, this time more carefully, and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between awe and grief. How did you do all this without me knowing? I said, you weren't looking, and I tried to keep accusation from my tone, aiming instead for simple observation. You suggested that I had deliberately hid this using a different name, keeping everything secret, after you made it clear that my actual work was an embarrassment. Mother, do you remember what you said when I told you about helping Amara with her asylum case, when I first started getting serious about refugee advocacy? She shook her head slowly. You said, "That's lovely, dear, but don't get too attached to these projects." Projects, like it was a craft hobby I'd eventually outgrow. And when I didn't outgrow it, when I kept pursuing this work, you became increasingly dismissive. Every conversation about my life was redirected to your concerns, who I was dating, why I wasn't married, when I'd settle down and do something serious.
"Because I was worried about you," she said, her voice rising defensively. "You seemed to be drifting, wasting your education and your potential on—" She stopped herself, finally hearing how her own words sounded. "On what?" I prompted. "On helping traumatized families rebuild their lives? On developing innovative integration models that actually work? On creating systemic change in how refugee services are delivered? That's what you considered wasting my potential?" She pressed her fingers to her temples, a gesture I recognized from my childhood when she was processing information that didn't fit her worldview. "I thought you were volunteering, doing part-time work with some small local organization. I didn't realize it was your entire career, your whole life. If you just told me—" "I tried," I said, and felt 4 years of suppressed frustration rising in my chest. "Dozens of times I tried. When we opened the second facility, I told you about it at Sunday dinner. Do you remember what you said?" She shook her head again, clearly not remembering. "You said, 'That's ambitious for a hobby,' and then asked if I'd met anyone interesting lately. When we got the first foundation grant, I mentioned it over lunch at this very club. You said, 'I suppose every nonprofit gets donations,' and changed the subject to ask about my plans for the summer social season. Every single significant milestone I tried to share with you, and every single time you minimized it, dismissed it, or outright ignored it to redirect the conversation to what you considered more important." The specific example seemed to land differently than general accusations. I watched my mother's face as she processed these concrete instances of her own dismissiveness, unable to wave them away as my misperception or exaggeration. The pattern was so consistent that I finally realized you weren't capable of seeing what I was building. Not because you lacked intelligence, but because acknowledging the significance of my work would have required adjusting your entire understanding of who I was and what my life should be. It was easier for you to maintain the narrative that I was wasting my potential than to confront the possibility that your definition of potential was too narrow. "So you decided to just lie to me?" She grasped at this point as though it might provide moral high ground. "For 4 years you maintained this elaborate deception?" "I maintained 2 separate identities because you couldn't accept the real one. There was no deception in my actual work. Safe Harbor is completely legitimate and transparent. The only deception was allowing you to continue believing I was someone I'm not, because fighting that belief constantly was exhausting and unproductive." James shifted slightly by the door, a subtle reminder of his presence. My mother's eyes moved to him, seeming to really see him for the first time since we'd entered the room. "The security," she said slowly. "Richard said something about trafficking rings and threats. Were you really in danger?" "I am in danger. Present tense. Safe Harbor's work in Eastern Europe and the Middle East has disrupted several human trafficking operations. We've helped prosecute smugglers, exposed corrupt officials taking bribes to ignore trafficking, shut down networks that were exploiting refugees. That's what creates enemies who express their displeasure through very specific threats." I pulled out my own phone, opened my secure messaging app, and showed her the threat assessment report James's team had compiled 3 months ago. She read the document with widening eyes, detailed descriptions of credible threats, security protocols implemented across all our facilities, risk levels assessed for various operations. "This one," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, pointing to a specific threat from a trafficking network we'd helped dismantle in Greece. "They threatened to—" She couldn't finish reading it out loud. "Which is why James and his team are assigned to me full-time," I said quietly. "The Foreign Office doesn't provide Royal Protection Command veterans for theatrical purposes. They assess risk and respond accordingly. The risk in my case was assessed as significant enough to warrant serious security measures." My mother set the phone down carefully, as though it might explode. Her hands were shaking visibly now.
You could have been killed. You could still be killed. And I knew nothing about it. I called your security guard melodramatic. The full weight of her ignorance was finally becoming real to her, not just that she'd misunderstood the scale of my work, but that she'd been completely unaware of genuine danger threatening her daughter's life. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked again, and this time the question carried different weight, not accusatory, but genuinely uncomprehending. "Even if you thought I wouldn't understand your work, surely you would have told me you were in danger." I sat down finally, the adrenaline that had sustained me through the public confrontation beginning to ebb. Would you have believed me? Or would you have thought I was exaggerating for attention, being melodramatic, making myself seem more important than I was? Because that's exactly what you said the first time you met James. She opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. We both knew I was right. The distance between us didn't happen suddenly. It built gradually, conversation by conversation, dismissal by dismissal, until we were living in completely different realities. You thought I was a disappointment, wasting my life. I knew I was building something meaningful. Those two perceptions couldn't coexist in honest communication, so communication stopped being honest.
My mother's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Tears began sliding down her face, smearing her expensive makeup. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen her cry. "I've been a terrible mother," she whispered. "You've been a mother with very specific expectations who couldn't adjust when I didn't meet them," I said, trying for accuracy rather than comfort or condemnation. That's not quite the same thing. The silence that followed my mother's breakdown lasted nearly a full minute. James remained by the door, professionally neutral, but I caught the subtle shift in his posture that suggested concern. He'd seen targets experience shock before, and my mother was displaying classic symptoms: trembling hands, shallow breathing, the 1,000-yard stare of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality had just been dismantled. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. She flinched at the contact, then gripped my fingers with surprising strength, as though I might disappear if she didn't physically anchor me to the moment. "I need to see it," she said abruptly, her voice hoarse from crying. "Not on a phone screen. I need to see what you've actually built." The request caught me off guard. "You want to visit Safe Harbor?" "Yes, now, tonight." She was already reaching for her clutch, trying to compose herself, wiping away tears with trembling fingers. "If I'm going to understand any of this, I need to see it with my own eyes." I glanced at James, who gave a barely perceptible nod. Security-wise, the Philadelphia facility was thoroughly vetted. Emotionally, I wasn't sure this was wise. My mother was clearly fragile, and our facilities could be intense environments, even for prepared visitors. But perhaps that intensity was exactly what this moment required. "All right," I said, "but you need to understand this isn't a tour for donors where we show polished programs and happy endings. This is a working facility at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night. You'll see real families dealing with real trauma. If you can't handle that with dignity and respect, we're not going." My mother straightened her spine, summoning some reserve of composure. "I can handle it." 20 minutes later, James was driving us through South Philadelphia in the armored SUV the Foreign Office had provided, my mother sitting in the back seat, staring out the window as familiar landmarks gave way to neighborhoods she probably never visited. The facility occupied a converted warehouse in an industrial area. Not picturesque, but functional and accessible to public transportation. As we pulled up, I saw Maya's car still in the lot. She'd stayed late again, probably processing intake paperwork for the Somali family that had arrived yesterday. I texted her that I was bringing a visitor, received back a string of question marks, and replied simply, "My mother. Long story." The facility's exterior was deliberately understated. No obvious signage, just a street number and a small plaque by the door. Security measures were invisible but comprehensive. James had personally overseen the installation of systems that would make this building one of the safest locations in the city. Inside, the transformation was immediate. What had been a warehouse was now a welcoming space, designed to balance efficiency with dignity. The main entrance opened into a reception area with comfortable seating, children's play corner, and soft lighting that felt nothing like the institutional harshness of typical social service facilities. Maya emerged from the administrative wing, her expression carefully neutral as she assessed my mother. "Director," she said formally, then noticed my reddened cheek where the slap had left visible marks. Her eyes hardened. "Are you all right?" "It's been an eventful evening," I said carefully. "Maya Singh, this is my mother, Claudia Ashford. Mother, Maya is Safe Harbor's Director of Operations. She's been with us since the beginning." Maya's handshake was professionally correct, but distinctly cool. She'd heard enough about my mother over the years to have formed opinions, and those opinions were apparently reflected in her greeting. "Mrs. Ashford, welcome to Safe Harbor, Philadelphia. This is our flagship facility, currently housing 43 families comprising 162 individuals across 23 nationalities." The statistics seemed to ground my mother slightly, giving her concrete details to process. "That many in this building?" "We have 3 floors," Maya explained, gesturing toward the elevator. "Ground floor contains administration, legal services, medical clinic, community spaces, and children's programming areas. Second and third floors are residential, actual apartments, not dormitory-style shelter beds. Each family has private space with kitchen facilities, bathrooms, and separate sleeping areas." She led us toward the elevator, continuing the tour with professional efficiency. "Average stay is 8 months while asylum cases are processed and families establish stability. We provide legal representation, employment assistance, trauma counseling, children's education support, and community integration services, all coordinated through single case management to minimize bureaucratic burden on families." The elevator doors opened on the 2nd floor, revealing a carpeted hallway that could have belonged to any modest apartment building. Children's artwork decorated the walls, colorful drawings mixed with family photos and multilingual welcome signs. We passed an open community kitchen where several women were preparing food together, the air rich with unfamiliar spices. They glanced at us curiously but continued their conversation in what sounded like Arabic. Through an open doorway, I could see children doing homework at a large table while a volunteer tutor was working with them. "This is the family integration wing," Maya explained, "shared spaces designed to build community while respecting privacy. Many of our residents come from cultures with strong communal traditions. Isolating them in separate apartments would be culturally inappropriate and potentially harmful." My mother was silent, absorbing details with an intensity I recognized from her approach to anything that challenged her existing frameworks. She noticed everything: the quality of the furnishings, the children's laughter, the multilingual signage, the sense of organized purpose underlying what could have been chaos. Maya stopped at a door marked with both English and Arabic script. "This is Laila Al-Rahman's apartment. She's expecting us. I called ahead while you were coming up." She knocked, and a woman in her 30s opened the door, a toddler balanced on her hip. Her face broke into a warm smile when she saw me. "Director Natasha," she said, her English accented but clear. "Please, come in. You bring visitors?" Lila's apartment was small but carefully maintained. Living area with a sofa and television, kitchenette along one wall, 2 bedroom doors visible beyond. Children's toys were organized in bins, school papers covered the refrigerator, and the space carried the unmistakable markers of a home rather than temporary shelter. "Lila, this is my mother, Claudia Ashford. She wanted to understand Safe Harbor's work. Would you mind sharing your experience?" Lila gestured us to the sofa, settling into a chair with practiced ease, despite the toddler now climbing over her. "Of course. You want tea?"
I just make. My mother accepted, and I watched her navigate this unexpected social situation, being offered hospitality by a refugee in a facility she hadn't known existed an hour ago. To her credit, she accepted gracefully, settling onto the sofa with the kind of attention she usually reserved for important business meetings. Lila returned with tea and mismatched mugs, explaining as she served, "We arrived here 4 months ago from Damascus. My husband was journalist. He was killed for his writing. I escaped with my children, 3 of them. We spend 1 year in Turkey, very bad situation, then come to America." She spoke matter-of-factly about trauma that would have destroyed most people I knew. My mother's tea remained untouched as she listened. "When we first arrive, I have nothing. Some clothes, papers, children, that's all. We go to shelter, very crowded, no privacy, children crying all night. Then, Safe Harbor find us. Bring us here." Lila's voice softened. "First time in 2 years, we have home, private home, kitchen. My children have beds, not sleeping on floor with strangers." The toddler on her lap started fussing, and Lila shifted him expertly. "But more than apartment, Safe Harbor give us future. Maya helped me with asylum case, approved in 2 months, very fast. Medical clinic, treat my daughter's asthma, give medicine we cannot afford. Employment team helped me find job at hospital. Cleaning at first, but they helped me get certification as medical translator. Now I work 3 days a week. I save money. My children go to good school." She paused, looking directly at my mother. "Director Natasha, come here every week. Remember all children's names. Ask about school, about dreams. She tell my son he can be engineer like he want. In Syria, after father died, he stopped dreaming. Here, he dream again." My mother's composure finally cracked again, tears spilling over as she grasped the human reality behind the statistics. "I'm so sorry for what you endured." Lila smiled gently. "Thank you, but no pity. We survive. We build new life. Safe Harbor make that possible. Your daughter," she gestured to me, "she changed my family's future, not with money, with respect, with seeing us as people, not problems." After we left Lila's apartment, my mother was silent as Maya continued the tour. We visited the medical clinic where a volunteer doctor was treating a child's ear infection. We saw the legal services wing where 2 attorneys were preparing asylum cases. We stopped by the Children's Education Center where evening tutoring was wrapping up. Each space revealed the same pattern: professional service delivery combined with genuine human dignity. This wasn't charity. It was systematic, sophisticated social infrastructure designed to address complex problems with evidence-based solutions. Finally, we reached my office on the administrative floor. It was modest but functional. Desk covered with case files, walls lined with photos of families we'd served, certificates and awards I'd never brought home because there had been nowhere to display them. My mother studied the wall of photos for a long time, recognizing perhaps for the first time the scope and substance of what I had built. Awards from the United Nations Refugee Agency, commendations from the State Department, photos of me with international officials, with families, with staff members across multiple continents. "This is real," she said, finally, her voice barely audible. "All of it. This isn't some small volunteer project. This is significant work creating actual impact." "Yes," I said simply. "This is what I've been building while you called it a hobby." She turned from the wall, her face showing exhaustion and something deeper, the beginning of genuine comprehension about what her dismissiveness had cost. "I don't know how to process this," she admitted. "Everything I thought I knew about your life was wrong, and that means everything I thought about us was wrong, too." The days following that night moved with disorienting speed, each one bringing new revelations and uncomfortable reckonings that neither my mother nor I had anticipated. The morning after the country club incident, I woke up to find my phone flooded with messages,
colleagues expressing concern, board members seeking clarification, and most unexpectedly, 3 voicemails from my mother. The first, left at 3:47 a.m., was barely coherent. "Natasha, I can't sleep. I keep thinking about that woman, Lila, and what she said about you remembering her children's names. I don't know your staff members' names. I don't know anything."
The second, at 6:12 a.m., was more composed. "I've been looking at the Safe Harbor website all night. There's a video of you speaking at some conference in Geneva. You're confident, articulate, commanding. I didn't recognize you. Or maybe I've never actually seen you. I don't know which is worse." The third, at 7:30 a.m., was direct. "I want to help. I don't know how, but I want to understand this work properly. Not as a donor looking for tax benefits, but as someone who needs to learn what actually matters. Will you let me try?" I called her back after my morning security briefing with James, uncertain what this new dynamic meant, but willing to explore it. She answered on the first ring, her voice carrying an unfamiliar quality, uncertainty without the usual defensive edge. "Can I come to your office today?" she asked. "Not for a tour, to work, to see what you actually do." 3 hours later, she arrived at Safe Harbor dressed in casual slacks and a simple blouse. Clothing I'd rarely seen her wear, her usual designer armor replaced with something more appropriate for a working facility. Maya greeted her with cautious professionalism, clearly skeptical about this sudden transformation, but willing to give it a chance. "We have intake interviews this morning," I told my mother. 3 families arriving from our Athens facility, transitioning to permanent resettlement here. You can observe if you stay quiet and let our team lead." She nodded, following me to the intake wing where our resettlement coordinator, Jennifer Park, was preparing for the arrivals. Jennifer was a former immigration attorney who joined Safe Harbor 2 years ago, bringing sophisticated legal expertise and genuine compassion to complex cases. The first family, a couple in their 50s with an adult son who had cerebral palsy, arrived exhausted from their journey, but visibly relieved to have reached this next stage. Jennifer conducted the intake interview with practiced efficiency, asking detailed questions about medical needs, employment history, education, family connections, and trauma history, while simultaneously putting them at ease. I watched my mother absorb the process, seeing perhaps for the first time the complexity involved in refugee resettlement. This wasn't simple charity. It was intricate coordination of legal, medical, social, and economic systems, each requiring specialized expertise and sustained attention. When Jennifer asked about the son's medical needs, documenting his disability and medication requirements, my mother leaned forward with unexpected focus. Later, during a break, she approached Jennifer directly. "That young man, his cerebral palsy requires specialized physical therapy. I serve on the board at Westbridge Rehabilitation Center. I could make introductions, potentially expedite his intake there." Jennifer's eyebrows rose, glancing at me for confirmation before responding. "That would be incredibly helpful. We usually face 6-month wait lists for specialized services." My mother pulled out her phone, making notes with the kind of directed energy I recognized from her charity work, except this time it wasn't about advancing her social standing. She was solving an actual problem for an actual person. Over the following days, this pattern repeated and intensified. My mother began arriving at Safe Harbor each morning, initially observing but gradually taking on specific tasks. She used her extensive society connections to unlock resources that had been perpetually out of reach: specialized medical care, employment opportunities with her network of business owners, housing options through her real estate connections. The transformation was startling, but not entirely surprising. My mother had always been competent, organized, effective. She had simply been applying those capabilities to endeavors I'd considered superficial: fundraising for organizations she didn't really understand, maintaining social networks that prioritize status over substance. Given actual meaningful work, she demonstrated unexpected aptitude. Maya remained skeptical. "I don't trust sudden conversions. People don't fundamentally change overnight. She's been dismissing your work for 4 years. One emotional night doesn't undo that pattern."
I know, I acknowledged. But maybe she's not fundamentally changing. Maybe she's redirecting capabilities she already had towards something that actually matters. The organization skills, the networking ability, the strategic thinking, those were always there. They were just misapplied. Or maybe she's trying to control the narrative. The society pages have been brutal. Prominent socialite slaps daughter who secretly runs international charity. Ashford family drama exposes years of maternal dismissalness. This could be damage control, not genuine transformation. The media coverage had been extensive and unflattering. Diane Thornberry's piece in the Chronicle had been particularly detailed, including interviews with gala attendees and pointed commentary about parental dismissiveness undermining accomplished children. Richard Hammond's segment on the International News Network had focused more on Safe Harbor's work, but included the context of family dysfunction that had brought it to wider attention. My mother's social circle had reacted with predictable complexity, some rushing to her defense with explanations about misunderstandings, others quietly distancing themselves from the scandal, a few expressing long-held observations about her difficult relationship with me that they had previously kept private. Patricia Westbrook had been blunt in her public statement. Claudia Ashford is my friend, but friendship doesn't excuse striking your child in public or dismissing her extraordinary humanitarian work as a hobby. I hope this incident prompts genuine reflection rather than mere image management. That statement had cut deep, I knew. Patricia's opinion mattered enormously in my mother's world, and her willingness to publicly criticize carried weight that tabloid coverage never could. 2 weeks after the gala incident, Safe Harbor's board convened for our quarterly meeting. My mother asked if she could attend as an observer, wanting to understand our governance structure and decision-making processes. The board members, accomplished professionals from legal, medical, nonprofit, and business sectors, agreed with some reservation.
The meeting covered complex operational challenges, funding gaps for our Jordan expansion, security concerns following recent threats, regulatory complications with our Greece operations, and strategic decisions about potential partnership with the European Union's refugee integration program. My mother sat silently through most of it, taking notes but not participating. But when discussion turned to fundraising strategies, she raised her hand tentatively. "May I make a suggestion?" The board chair, Dr. Raymond Foster, nodded permission. "You're approaching foundations that fund humanitarian work broadly," my mother said, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. "But your integration model has specific applications to healthcare systems, education infrastructure, and workforce development. Those are separate funding streams you're not accessing. The Westbrook Foundation's Healthcare Innovation Fund, the Jameson Trust's Education Initiative, the Morrison Morup's Workforce Development Program. None of those are on your prospect list, but Safe Harbor's work directly addresses their priority areas." Maya's expression shifted from skeptical to attentive. "Those funding sources require different proposal frameworks than standard humanitarian grants." "Yes," my mother agreed, "which is why you'd need someone who understands both the funding landscape and how to translate your work into language that resonates with different sectors. I've served on enough foundation boards to know how they evaluate proposals. I could help develop targeted funding strategies." The offer hung in the air, pragmatic rather than emotional. This wasn't about redemption or guilt. It was about deploying specific expertise toward organizational needs. Dr. Foster looked at me, his expression questioning. "Director?" I considered carefully. My mother's foundation connections were extensive and valuable. Her ability to navigate elite philanthropic networks could unlock resources we desperately needed. But accepting her help would formalize her involvement with Safe Harbor in ways that felt premature given our still fragile personal reconciliation. "Let's start with a 3-month consulting arrangement," I proposed. "Develop targeted funding strategies for 3 specific areas: healthcare, education, and workforce development. If that's productive, we can discuss longer-term involvement." My mother nodded acceptance of these terms, understanding perhaps that trust needed to be rebuilt incrementally through demonstrated commitment rather than immediate full integration.
After the meeting, as board members dispersed, Dr. Foster pulled me aside. That was handled well. Clear boundaries, concrete deliverables, evaluation period. Don't let family dynamics compromise organizational integrity. I won't, I assured him, though privately I wondered if maintaining that separation was even possible anymore. The personal and professional had become so thoroughly intertwined that disentangling them seemed both necessary and impossible. That evening, my mother invited me to dinner, not at her club or one of the expensive restaurants she preferred, but at a small Ethiopian restaurant near Safe Harbor that several staff members had recommended. We sat at a low table, sharing injera and vegetable stews, the informal setting creating space for conversation that formal settings would have constrained. "I've been thinking about why I couldn't see what you were building," she said, tearing off a piece of injera with careful attention. It wasn't just dismissiveness, it was fear. I waited, not prompting, letting her work through thoughts she clearly needed to articulate. "Your father and I built our life around very specific markers of success. The right schools, the right career, the right marriage into the right family. When he died, maintaining that structure became how I honored his memory. And you didn't fit that structure. You wanted different things, valued different measures of achievement. Acknowledging that your path was valid meant questioning whether ours had been. The honesty was unexpected and uncomfortable. So dismissing my work protected your identity?" "Yes," she admitted. "If my humanitarian work was just a hobby, then my life choices remained unquestioned. But if your work was genuinely important, genuinely valuable, then I had to confront what I'd actually accomplished. Which is what? Maintaining social position, fundraising for organizations I didn't really understand, looking good while accomplishing little of substance." The transformation of our relationship over the following month felt both profound and precarious, like watching something fragile take shape without knowing if it would solidify or shatter. My mother threw herself into Safe Harbor's work with an intensity that surprised everyone, including herself. The 3-month consulting arrangement became a framework for something neither of us had quite anticipated: genuine collaboration, built on mutual respect rather than obligatory family ties. Her first major contribution came through restructuring our foundation outreach strategy. She'd identified 12 major philanthropic organizations whose funding priorities aligned perfectly with Safe Harbor's work, but required proposal frameworks completely different from our standard humanitarian pitch. Within 3 weeks, she developed tailored proposals for each, leveraging personal relationships with board members to secure meetings that would have taken us months to arrange independently. The Jameson Trust meeting was particularly revealing. My mother had arranged a presentation to their education committee, and I watched her navigate the room with practiced expertise, understanding exactly how to frame our children's integration programs in language that resonated with education funders rather than refugee advocates. Safe Harbor's model addresses achievement gaps through trauma-informed educational support, she explained, displaying data on educational outcomes for children in our programs. Within 18 months, 93% of school-age children reach grade-level performance. That's not just humanitarian success, it's educational infrastructure delivering measurable results. The committee members responded with engaged questions, and by the end of the meeting, we'd secured a $1.8 million grant specifically for education programming expansion. Walking out of that building, I felt something shift in how I perceived my mother's capabilities. She wasn't just helping, she was genuinely effective in ways that complemented my own skills. "You're good at this," I told her in the car afterwards.
She smiled, but it carried notes of sadness. I always was. I just never applied it to anything that actually mattered. But not everything about this new dynamic was smooth. The board meeting 3 weeks later exposed underlying tensions that hadn't been resolved despite surface-level collaboration. We were discussing security protocols following an escalated threat assessment, and James was presenting recommendations that included additional protective measures for key staff members. My mother interrupted mid-presentation. "Is all this security really necessary? It seems excessive for a nonprofit organization." The room fell silent. Maya's expression hardened immediately, and I saw several board members exchange uncomfortable glances. Mrs. Ashford, James said with careful professional courtesy, these protocols are based on intelligence assessments for multiple government agencies. The threats against Director Ashford and other staff members are credible, specific, and ongoing. But surely some of this is precautionary. Natasha, you've been doing this work for 4 years. If the danger was truly significant— Mother, my voice came out sharper than intended. You don't get to question security assessments made by intelligence professionals. Your discomfort with the reality of my work doesn't change that reality. She recoiled slightly, and I saw hurt flash across her face. But Maya leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. Mrs. Ashford, with respect, 6 weeks ago, you didn't know this organization existed. James has been protecting the director for 8 months based on threat assessments you've never seen. Perhaps trust the expertise in the room rather than your personal comfort level. The rebuke was warranted, but created visible tension. My mother sat back, clearly stung, and the meeting continued awkwardly. After adjournment, she left quickly without the usual conversation, and I felt the fragility of our rebuilt relationship acutely. That evening she called. I overstepped today. Yes, you did. I think part of me still can't fully accept that you're in danger. If I accept that, I have to accept that I was completely oblivious while you were facing genuine threats. That's harder than questioning the security assessment. The psychological honesty was uncomfortable, but important. Your discomfort doesn't change the facts, Mother. People who profit from human trafficking don't issue empty threats. We've helped prosecute network operators, exposed corruption, shut down profitable operations. That creates enemies who express their displeasure violently. James isn't being paranoid. He's being appropriate. She was quiet for a long moment. Tell me about the worst threat, the one that prompted the Foreign Office assignment. I hesitated, but then decided she needed to understand completely. I described the incident in Athens, the explicit death threat delivered to our facility, the surveillance we'd detected, the credible intelligence indicating a trafficking network had targeted me specifically for our role in a prosecution that had resulted in 40-year sentences for their leadership. They sent photos of me leaving the facility, I said quietly. Time-stamped, showing that they'd been watching for weeks. The message was explicit about what they planned to do. That's when the Foreign Office assigned James, and that's why security isn't optional or excessive. It's the minimum necessary response to documented threat. I heard her breathing become uneven on the other end of the line. You could have been killed. Yes, I still could be. That's the reality of this work. It matters enormously, but it's not safe. And you can't be involved in safe harbor while also questioning whether the dangers are real. Those positions are incompatible. I understand, she said. And for once, she seemed to genuinely mean it. The following week brought unexpected convergence of my mother's old world and my actual work. The International Humanitarian Innovation Prize ceremony was scheduled in New York, and the UN had requested I bring family members to the formal reception. I'd initially planned to attend alone, but my mother asked if she could come. She said she wanted to see me receive this recognition, properly, not hidden away like something shameful, but publicly, with people who understand what I've accomplished. The ceremony took place at the UN headquarters, a formal affair with diplomatic protocols and significant international attendance. My mother arrived dressed impeccably, designer gown, perfect hair and makeup, but her demeanor was different than I'd seen at society events. Less performative, more genuinely present. When my name was called for the award presentation, I walked to the stage with James maintaining discreet proximity. The Secretary General presented the medal and certificate, speaking about Safe Harbor's innovative integration model and its potential to transform global refugee services. The applause was warm, professional, genuine recognition from the international humanitarian community. From the stage, I could see my mother in the audience, tears streaming down her face, clapping with an intensity that seemed to contain years of withheld recognition, finally released. At the reception afterwards, she watched me interact with diplomats, NGO leaders, and government officials with visible amazement. This was my professional context, not society fundraisers where I was the disappointing daughter, but international forums where I was a respected innovator whose work influenced policy. Patricia Westbrook approached us during the reception, having flown in specifically for the ceremony. She embraced me warmly, then turned to my mother with an expression that mixed warmth with pointed assessment. "Claudia, lovely to see you here supporting your daughter properly." My mother accepted the implicit rebuke with grace. "I'm learning what proper support actually looks like, Patricia. It's been educational."
Patricia's expression softened slightly. Personal transformation is possible at any age, but it requires sustained commitment, not just reactive adjustment to public embarrassment. The observation was characteristically blunt, and I watched my mother absorb it without defensiveness. You're absolutely right, which is why I'm not just attending ceremonial events. I'm working with Safe Harbor's development team to expand sustainable funding streams. Natasha has allowed me to contribute in areas where I actually have expertise. Has she now? Patricia looked at me with raised eyebrows. That's generous, given recent history. It's strategic, I corrected. My mother has foundation connections and fundraising expertise that benefit the organization. Personal reconciliation and professional collaboration aren't the same thing, though hopefully they're developing in parallel. The distinction seemed to satisfy Patricia, who nodded approvingly. Boundaries and pragmatism. Good. Too many nonprofits make hiring decisions based on emotional factors rather than organizational needs. Later that evening, my mother and I shared a car back to the hotel. She was quiet, processing the day's experiences, and finally spoke as we approached Midtown. Watching you in that context today, speaking with ambassadors, discussing policy with UN officials, receiving recognition from the Secretary General, I kept thinking about all the times I introduced you as my daughter who works with immigrants in that dismissive tone, as though it was something vaguely embarrassing rather than genuinely significant. Yes, I said simply, not sugarcoating the acknowledgement. I need you to know I understand now. Not just intellectually, but viscerally. You've built something extraordinary. You've created systemic change in how refugee services are delivered. You've influenced international policy. You've saved lives and restored dignity to thousands of families. That's not comparable to my charity board service. It's a completely different order of magnitude. The recognition mattered, though I'd stopped waiting for it years ago. I'm glad you see it now, but, Mother, I need you to understand, my work's value doesn't depend on your recognition. It existed before you acknowledged it, and it will continue regardless of your involvement. I've learned to find validation from the work itself and the people it serves, not from your approval. She nodded slowly. That's probably healthy, but it's also sad. Children should have parents who see them clearly, who recognize their accomplishments, who support their authentic path. I failed at that fundamentally. Yes, you did. I then agreed, but then added more gently, but you're showing up now. That matters too, even if it doesn't erase the past. 6 months had passed since the night my mother's hand connected with my face in the Grandview Country Club foyer, and the world that collision had shattered was still being rebuilt, though into something neither of us had imagined possible. I stood now in Safe Harbor's new conference room, preparing for our annual board retreat, watching through the glass walls as staff members moved through the expanded facility. We'd grown significantly. 3 new domestic locations, partnerships finalized with the European Union's integration program, and the UN pilot project launching next quarter. The work that my mother had once called a hobby now employed over 300 people across 4 continents. My mother arrived early, as she had for every meeting since formally joining our development team 3 months ago. The consulting arrangement had evolved into a permanent position, Director of Strategic Partnerships, after she'd secured $8.3 million in new foundation funding through channels we'd never successfully accessed before. The board had voted unanimously to formalize her role, recognizing that her contributions had become essential to our expansion capacity. She carried herself differently now. The designer armor remained, old habits of presentation died hard, but the performance quality had diminished. She was here to work, not to be seen working, and that distinction manifested in subtle ways that people who'd known her before immediately noticed. The Morrison Group confirmed, she said, setting down her briefcase and pulling out her tablet. Full 3-year commitment for workforce development programming. That's the last piece we needed for the comprehensive funding model. I reviewed the commitment letter she handed me, impressed despite myself. The Morrison Group grant represented not just funding, but validation of our expanded approach, recognition that refugee integration wasn't separate from workforce development, but central to it. This changes our capacity significantly. With sustained workforce funding, we can expand employment services across all facilities simultaneously, rather than phasing implementation. She agreed. That was the strategic goal. Piecemeal expansion creates inconsistent service delivery. Simultaneous implementation maintains quality standards while scaling impact. The conversation was purely professional, focused on organizational strategy rather than personal dynamics. We'd learned to maintain that separation, not because the personal had been resolved, but because both dimensions required distinct attention, and mixing them complicated both. Maya entered, followed by other board members, and the meeting began with standard operational updates: financial reports, program metrics, facility expansion timelines, partnership developments. My mother participated as any senior staff member would, contributing relevant expertise, asking clarifying questions, and deferring to others' specialized knowledge when appropriate. The transformation was remarkable precisely because it wasn't dramatic. She hadn't become a different person. She'd redirected existing capabilities towards meaningful work. The organizational skills, strategic thinking, and relationship management that had made her effective in society fundraising proved equally valuable in institutional philanthropy. She just needed purpose beyond social positioning to deploy them fully. But the board retreat's final session addressed something more personal: the upcoming international media profile that had been developing since the UN prize ceremony. A documentary team had been following Safe Harbor's work for 3 months, and their focus had inevitably included the family dynamics that had brought us wider attention.
They want to interview both of us, I told the board, together, discussing the relationship evolution and how personal reconciliation has affected organizational development. The request created visible discomfort around the table. Our personal story had become inseparable from Safe Harbor's public narrative, but deliberately spotlighting it felt different than simply acknowledging its existence. Dr. Foster voiced the concern directly. Does exposing your personal relationship serve the organization's mission, or does it risk reducing Safe Harbor's serious work to family drama entertainment? It was my mother who responded, surprisingly. I think we can't avoid it regardless. The story exists: society columnist coverage, social media documentation, the prize ceremony context. Refusing to address it directly leaves others to define the narrative. If we participate, we at least control how it's framed. And how would you frame it? Maya asked, her skepticism still evident despite months of productive collaboration. My mother considered carefully before answering. As a cautionary tale about how privilege can blind parents to their children's actual achievements, and how confronting that blindness, however painful, creates opportunity for genuine connection based on reality rather than expectation. The framing was honest without being self-indulgent, acknowledging fault without wallowing in guilt, focused on lessons rather than just confession. The board discussed further, ultimately approving our participation with clear parameters about keeping organizational missions central. 2 weeks later, the documentary crew set up in my office for the joint interview. My mother arrived precisely on time, composed but visibly nervous. We'd discussed our approach: honesty about the past, clarity about ongoing work, focus on transformation possibilities rather than just dysfunction documentation. The interviewer, Rachel Chen, was experienced with complex human interest stories. and her questions were thoughtful rather than sensationalistic. She began with factual foundation, safe harbors development, my mother's initial ignorance, the country club confrontation, before moving into more reflective territory. Mrs. Ashford, what was the moment you truly understood what your daughter had built? My mother paused, gathering thoughts carefully. Honestly, it wasn't one moment, but an accumulation. Seeing the facility, meeting families we serve, watching the board meeting, attending the UN ceremony, each experience added layers of recognition. But perhaps the deepest understanding came from working alongside the staff and seeing their expertise, dedication, and the systematic sophistication of what Natasha created. This isn't inspiration or luck. It's brilliant strategic thinking implemented through sustained, disciplined effort. And Natasha, when did you recognize your mother's involvement was genuine rather than performative? I considered that question's complexity. I'm still not entirely sure it matters whether it's genuine in some pure emotional sense. What matters is sustained behavioral change and effective contribution. My mother has spent 6 months learning this work, applying her considerable skills productively, and respecting boundaries about what she does and doesn't understand. Whether that comes from guilt, genuine transformation, or pragmatic adaptation is less important than the consistent pattern of appropriate engagement. Rachel turned back to my mother. That's a fairly clinical assessment from your daughter. How does that feel? My mother smiled slightly. Accurate. Natasha learned not to depend on my emotional validation years ago, a necessary adaptation to my persistent dismissiveness. Rebuilding trust requires demonstrating reliability through action, not demanding emotional credit for belatedly recognizing what should have been obvious. I've earned clinical assessment. Warmer regard will come, if it comes, through sustained appropriate behavior over years, not months. The self-awareness was striking, and I felt something shift in my own perception. She wasn't performing understanding, she actually understood the work required and wasn't demanding shortcuts through emotional appeal. The interview continued, exploring how our collaboration functioned, what challenges remained, how organizational boundaries helped rather than hindered personal reconciliation. She asked difficult questions about the slap itself, about years of dismissal, about whether full reconciliation was possible given that history. I don't know if full reconciliation is possible, or even the right goal, I said honestly. We're building a different relationship than we had before, one based on actual reality rather than roles and expectations. That relationship includes professional collaboration, careful personal boundaries, and realistic assessment of both progress and limitations. It's not the mother-daughter relationship I wanted as a child, but it might be the authentic connection we're actually capable of as adults. My mother nodded agreement, tears visible, but controlled. I can't undo years of dismissing Natasha's actual life while critiquing her failure to meet imaginary expectations. I can only acknowledge that harm honestly and work to build something better going forward. Whether that's enough is ultimately her decision, not mine. After the interview concluded and the crew departed, my mother and I sat in my office in comfortable silence. James was visible through the glass wall, maintaining his usual protective oversight, a permanent reminder of realities she'd once dismissed as melodramatic. "Thank you for letting me be part of this," she said finally. "You've earned it. Not through guilt or relationship claims, but through actual valuable contribution to work that matters." She smiled at that clinical assessment, recognizing it as the honest regard it represented. "I'll take that. It's more than I deserved 6 months ago." "Yes, it is," I agreed, then added more warmly. "But it's appropriate now. You've shown up consistently, respected boundaries, contributed meaningfully, and acknowledged reality without defensiveness. That's not nothing." We sat quietly for another moment, watching the facility's activity through my office windows, Families arriving for appointments, staff members coordinating services, children playing in the community space. All the tangible manifestation of visions sustained through years of work my mother had never seen.
I spent 28 years trying to shape you into someone you weren't, she said softly. And you spent the same years becoming someone extraordinary despite my interference. I think that says something important about resilience and authentic purpose. It says that people build meaningful lives from internal vision rather than external validation, I replied, which you're learning now too, redirecting your considerable capabilities toward work that matters for its own sake, rather than for social positioning. She nodded, accepting that assessment. Different paths to similar lessons. Perhaps that's the best we can build from where we started. Perhaps it is, I agreed. The sun was setting over South Philadelphia, casting long shadows through my office windows. In 6 months, we'd traveled from violent confrontation through painful recognition toward cautious collaboration. The journey wasn't complete. Trust rebuilt gradually through sustained appropriate action, not overnight through emotional reconciliation. But the foundation was there, built on honesty rather than pretense, on actual reality rather than comfortable fiction. My mother stood to leave, gathering her materials. Same time tomorrow for the employment partnership meeting? Same time tomorrow, I confirmed. She paused at the door. I'm proud of you, Natasha. I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. I'm proud of what you've built and who you've become, despite every obstacle I placed in your path. The words landed differently than they would have years ago, not as the validation I'd once desperately wanted, but as simple acknowledgement of reality. Thank you. That means something now because it's based on actual understanding rather than obligatory maternal sentiment. She smiled at that characteristically clinical response, recognizing it as the honest regard it represented, and left. I sat alone in my office as evening deepened, thinking about transformation and its limits, about redemption earned through sustained action rather than emotional declaration, about building authentic connection from honest foundation, however that foundation was established. The path forward remained uncertain in many ways, but for the first time in our relationship, it proceeded from shared recognition of actual reality, and that itself represented transformation worth acknowledging. Whatever came next, we would at least be seeing the same world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.